All right, so today we're going to take a deep dive into some recent comments from Cameron about Kanye West. And I think, it's always interesting to hear from fellow artists and how they kind of view these very public situations.
No, I think this is really interesting because, we're getting like the perspective of somebody in the hip hop community looking at Kanye's recent behavior and kind of like their take on it.
Yeah.
So it's not just like us, on the outside looking in.
Right. It's a different perspective for sure.
Exactly.
So really the core of what Cameron has said is that he feels like a lot of what we're seeing from Kanye is really an act for the cameras. And he also raises some, pretty interesting points about Kanye's general well-being, which I think is something a lot of people have been thinking about. And so our goal here is to really kind of explore those observations and really unpack, the motivations and how somebody who's a peer in the industry views all this stuff.
Yeah, it's not just some like random person who's speculating.
Right.
This is somebody who has been in similar spaces.
Exactly.
With the pressures and the, the limelight and everything.
Yeah.
So his analysis is a little bit more weighty, I feel like.
Definitely, yeah. So let's start with his initial reaction. Cameron straight up said that he was disgusted by a recent interview that Kanye did, which is a pretty strong word.
Yeah.
To use, from one artist about another.
Yeah, that's pretty intense. It suggests that whatever Kanye was doing in this interview really, really like set him off.
Yeah.
Like he was not happy with it.
Right. And it's not like Kanye doesn't have a history of controversial moments. Cameron even brought up some historical context here, reminding us that Kanye has been making these kinds of headlines for years.
Right.
He even mentioned, the George Bush doesn't care about black people comment during the Hurricane Katrina aftermath.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a big moment to bring up, I think, because it was so huge at the time. And it really shows that Karen's not looking at this as like a new thing.
Right.
Yeah. This is like part of a pattern.
Yeah, it's an established pattern.
Exactly. Of Kanye just like speaking his mind.
Right.
And, often in ways that cause a lot of controversy.
Totally. Yeah.
So I think that's important to remember.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Cameron's theory takes an interesting turn when he suggests that this current behavior is worse because of the platforms that Kanye is now using. He's implying that maybe with less access to mainstream media, Kanye's relying more on smaller outlets, like that interview that he did with DJ Academics.
Yeah, I think that that's a really interesting observation about how the media landscape has changed.
Yeah.
And how that can affect, who gets a platform and what they say.
Right.
And I think Cameron is suggesting that, maybe this isn't Kanye's preferred choice, but this is kind of what he's got right now.
Yeah. Maybe out of necessity.
Exactly.
Which brings us to this idea of, the act. So he's specifically talking about the Academics interview. And he says that before the cameras were rolling, Kanye wasn't wearing, the controversial KKK attire, and he was acting normally. But then, as soon as that interview started, he seemed to shift into this, yay persona.
Right.
And then went back to being normal once the camera stopped.
Yeah, so this is the core of what Cameron is analyzing.
Right.
It's the performative aspect of Kanye's public image. So he's basically saying there's this switch that flips.
Right.
Between how Kanye acts in private and how he acts when all eyes are on him.
Yeah.
And it's is that genuine or is that some kind of calculated image?
Right. And I think that really does make you think about the pressures of fame and just the need to control your own narrative in a way.
Yeah, totally.
But beyond that, Cameron also expressed some really genuine concern for Kanye's well-being.
Right.
He specifically said that despite claims of wealth, that Kanye doesn't look like a happy person in life. So that's adding a whole other layer to this.
Yeah, it's it's not just analyzing the behavior. It's there's a human being here.
Exactly.
And material success doesn't always equal happiness.
Right.
And he's calling that out.
Totally, yeah. And some of Kanye's actions have drawn a lot of criticism across the board. Cameron specifically called out Kanye's decision to involve JYZ's children in a Twitter rant.
Yeah.
And he really questioned, the appropriateness of that. And it really sounded like that was something that...
Yeah, I think that's a big deal.
Yeah.
Regardless of what beef adults had, bringing kids into it is...
Yeah, it's crossing a line.
Not cool. And I think Cameron is echoing a lot of people's feelings there.
Yeah.
You know?
Totally. And then there's the competitive side of things. You know, Kanye's repeatedly said that he's the #1 artist. He's even taken some shots at Kendrick Lamar. And Cameron basically was like, look, you know, to maintain that top spot,
Yeah.
it takes consistent effort. You can't just say it.
Yeah, there's like there's a truth to that about artistic relevance.
Yeah.
It's like, just because you were the best at some point
Right.
doesn't mean you're always going to be the best.
Right.
And you have to keep working and like putting out good stuff.
Yeah.
Or else somebody else is going to come and take your spot.
Totally. Yeah.
So I think that's a really good point.
Absolutely. And finally, in terms of controversial actions, Cameron mentioned that Kanye wearing that black KKK outfit,
Right.
it didn't really surprise him given Kanye's history.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because obviously the imagery is very offensive.
Yeah.
But he's like, this is not shocking to me
Yeah.
based on what I know about Kanye.
Right. Right. So to kind of sum it all up,
Yeah.
It seems like Cameron feels like there's a really big performative aspect to what we're seeing from Kanye and Pablo's.
Mm-hmm.
He's got genuine concerns about Kanye's happiness.
Right.
And he strongly disagrees with specific actions, like involving kids in these public disputes and, just making these claims about being #1 without actually putting in the work.
Yeah, he's basically giving us an insider perspective
Right.
from his own experience in the music
For
industry.
sure.
And he's like, look,
Right.
maybe there's a difference between Kanye's private reality and this public ye persona.
Right. And that public one is maybe a little more amplified than the reality.
Yeah. Maybe even constructed to get attention.
Yeah. It's all very interesting and thought-provoking. It really makes you think about how we view public figures these days.
Yeah.
Especially with social media and everything.
It's hard to know what's real
It really is.
and what's just for show. So, as a listener, I think that that's kind of the question that we're left with.
Yeah.
In this world of carefully crafted online identities and this constant pressure to make a big splash,
Right.
how do we know what's authentic and what's just an act?
Especially with artists who are always trying to pearl the boundaries.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like this weird mix of fame and art and like the individual person.
Yeah.
And it's definitely worth thinking about.